Go in the description, subscribe to the New Testament Review Podcast with Ian Mills and Laura Robinson.
Ian Mills, can't wait to call you doctor. Professor, can you educate me on who Marcion is? I've heard he was the first guy who discovered or had a gospel or something. I'm ignorant, so everything Marcion, please.
So Marcion is a super important Christian figure from the beginning into the middle 2nd century. He would, of course, be rejected as a heretic by later Christians, but nevertheless is super influential for sort of shaping the sorts of things Christians were interested in, the sorts of things they were polemicizing against, and quite possibly even shaping the New Testament canon, or even giving us an idea of having the canon. Marcion is the first figure we see who says, we have these number of books as Christians, and these are our scriptures, and nothing else is. He seems to be the guy who comes up with that. So Marcion is a guy from Sinope. He's a ship owner. Nautes is the word used to describe him. It probably means he is some sort of merchant, probably owns a number of ships, and seems to have been very, very wealthy. He came to Rome sometime around 140, maybe a little earlier than that. The sources are inconsistent on when he came to Rome, but he comes to Rome and makes this huge payment to the Roman Church, which doesn't seem to be, here in the mid-2nd century, run by a single bishop. It seems to be run by a college of presbyters, and he makes this massive donation. And then while he's there, the timeline is probably impossible to reconstruct precisely, but there seems to have been a series of controversies where it came out that Marcion does not believe that the God of the Hebrew Bible, the God of the Jewish scriptures, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is the same God who is the Father of Jesus. There is a new God. Jesus reveals, according to Marcion, reveals a new Father, a new God, and the God of the Hebrew Bible there's a debate here, but is either a wicked God or is a merely judicial God. And there's a question over whether or not Marcion believed the other God was evil, which I think is probably the case, or just merely a God of pure justice. So this, of course, becomes a problem in the Roman Church. It is fascinating that someone like this could have been incorporated at first, without seeming to have occasion to much controversy. But there's reasons to believe that the church in Rome, again, being run as a series of churches with a series of leaders, was fairly diverse and inclusive. We seem to have lots of people using different kinds of gospels, holding different theologies, who were at least all in conversation in Rome in the middle of the 2nd century. But he gets kicked out and his donation is returned to him. At some point, whether this is happening already or only happens hereafter, Marcion goes on to found a series of churches across the Mediterranean Empire. These show up as, into Syria. We have the Marcionites seems to have been the mainstream kind of Christianity in the 2nd century in Syria. We have Syriac sources written by proto-Orthodox, mainstream, what we now consider the mainstream church, who are complaining that the word Christian is used in Syria to refer only to the Marcionites. And that when people talk about their kind of Christianity, the thing that we now think of as Orthodox Christianity, they call them Paludians, or Socratians, which is, they name them after their bishop. Just like we talk about Marcionites being followers of Marcion, it seemed that there are places and times where the thing that we think of as Orthodox Christianity was named after just a random guy, a guy named Polyt or a guy named Socrates. So the Marcionite Christianity spreads throughout the world. And we see already Justin Martyr writing maybe 10 to 15 years after Marcion comes to Rome and this controversy happens, says that Marcionites have covered the whole world. They're everywhere. Marcion, in advocating this distinctive theology, can't simply use the same New Testament we have. So Marcion has a significantly different New Testament. He has one gospel, and he has 10 Pauline letters. And sources before and after Marcion of other kinds of Christian groups and individuals writing seem to be very eclectic with their New Testament writings. They have a mishmash of gospels. We have, of course, the correspondence of Serapion with the church in Antioch, where he's aware they're using this Gospel of Peter, and that's no big deal. And then he finds out later that the Gospel of Peter is used by a group he doesn't like, and then writes back and says, okay, you should stop using this. There doesn't seem to be a canon. There doesn't seem to be a solid list of books. There are certain books that are acceptable and certain books that aren't, but people are using different books as they see fit. Marcion seems to change that. He says there are only 10 letters of Paul we should use. And interestingly that may not have been an innovation of Marcion. There's good reason to think we have other Christians, Basilides in Alexandria, P46, one of our earliest witnesses to the Pauline collection. A 10-letter collection of Paul may have been the first kind of, may have preceded it, may have preceded our 13-letter collection. The pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, may be later additions. Most scholars agree Paul didn't write those letters. And they may even reflect anti-Marcionite polemic. The pastoral epistles refer to the knowledge falsely so-called, referring probably to Gnostics, and to the Antitheses. And the Antitheses is the name of the work Marcion composed as a sort of prologue to his New Testament. So there may be evidence that the pastoral epistles are actually aware of Marcion. But backing up one second, we have the 10 letters of Paul, which Marcion edited. So he revised the content of these things. He cut out sections like Romans 9 through 11, which talk about, the history of Israel, God's interactions with Israel. And he edited the Gospel of Luke. So he gets rid of the other Gospels, or maybe he doesn't know them. It's really hard to tell. Tertullian does say he polemicizes against other Gospels. So it's possible he did indeed know other Gospels, and seems likely. A guy in Rome in the 2nd century would know of other Gospels. But he takes Luke and he edits that. So he cuts out chapters 1, 2, 3, with the exception of a single verse, and half of the 4th chapter, and then revises stuff along the way. And there are scholars who believe that Marcion's gospel was, in fact, the first gospel, or that Marcion's gospel was the first form of the Gospel of Luke, and that Luke is a revision of Marcion's gospel. And I think there's good reasons to say that's wrong, and this is part of my doctoral work. But this is a view that has attracted some serious scholars. I just don't think the evidence supports the view.
This is fascinating, this material. You mentioned something in passing, and I'm backing up to the Romans 9 to 11 thing. I interview Dr. Robert Price on the show all the time, and I'm going to be continuing to grow this channel and interview more scholars. You're an expert when it comes to Marcion, so I wanted your opinion on this, and I'm sure that you have one. There are some people who believe that Romans 9 through 11 don't fit in Rome, or in Paul's letter to the Romans. You're not in that school of thought? You don't think so?
No, I don't think it's a very mainstream view. I don't think, I think most Pauline scholars see Romans 9 through 11 as making a lot of sense in the letter of Romans. And I agree with them on that. There isn't textual evidence. There is to support the omission of this text. And the classic study on this is Ulrich Schmid wrote a monograph on Marcion's Pauline epistles. And Schmid comes down on this view as well, that Marcion indeed redacted the Pauline epistles in the 2nd century. And so, no, I think there's good reason to think that Marcion, in fact, revised these texts. I
know I'm asking you to somehow have a time machine and go back and figure out everything Marcion thought and why. But his views on God, quite strange that he would go that far and say, no, this is a different God. What do you think the reasoning? Is there any writings that give you the reasons why he believes this?
Yeah, so we don't have any of Marcion's work surviving. What we do have are lots of Christians responding to Marcion, and in doing so, they will quote his gospel, they will quote his Pauline epistles, and they will reference the content of the Antitheses. Now, the Antithesis I alluded to earlier is this preface that Marcion composed to the New Testament. And it seems to have been a sort of, it's called the Antithesis because Marcion is juxtaposing the image of God we get from the Jewish scriptures with the image of God we get from Jesus. And he's saying, look, Isaiah says that God creates evil, makes evil. Jesus doesn't look like that. The Hebrew Bible has God commanding murder, has God creating a flood to wipe out the human population, but Jesus doesn't. And so he's drawing out these contrasts. And of course, we have Tertullian responding and saying, like, look, no, this is why God behaved one way in one time and differently in Jesus. And this is an age-old problem that Christians have dealt with. We have Christians dealing with this in lots of different ways across history. Allegorical interpretation is very popular, of course, in the early church. And there's other ways to talk about why it is to deal with difficult texts in Scripture. Jewish interpreters and Christian interpreters struggle with these things. Marcion's solution was a radical one. Marcion's solution is that it's a different God. And we see the Gnostics, the varieties of Christianity who believe that saving knowledge of some sort will save you. Many of them adopted a similar solution. So Marcion is sometimes grouped with the Gnostics, although I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what's going on here. They're both addressing issues that Christian and Jewish interpreters from, before Christianity existed, are wrestling with how to deal with difficult texts. And the Gnostics and Marcion and Origen of Alexandria, with his allegorical interpretation, are all coming up with ways to address that. And so this is where we get Marcion's solution seems to have been to say these are different gods.
He went out hard with a strong stance that it seemed convincing to many people, though. Obviously, if it spread like wildfire,
yeah,
it makes you kind of wonder. I wish we could see more into the past and really see what was going on.
Yeah.
He was an ascetic.
Yes. It seems to be that he didn't believe in, he rejected sex, he was an advocate of fasting, he was an advocate of prayer. In fact, if we look at Marcion's practice, the hints we get about the way Marcion practiced his Christian faith, he actually looks very much like all the other Christians do. They gave money to the poor. Christian ascesis, saying sex is a bad thing, was super common in Christian texts. Even mainstream proto-Orthodox Christian texts. Everyone seems to kind of agree with this, and Paul seems to kind of agree with this. Paul says the better thing to do is to stop having sex, but if you must, you can give into it so you don't burn. Probably referring not to going to hell, but to burn with passion and make yourself sick. So it does seem to be a mainstream view. Marcion doesn't seem to be an outlier here. Marcion may have been a little more radical in giving up, sex entirely. But we see the same thing advocated in all sorts of non-Marcionite texts. We see one of the things that sets apart what we call the apocryphal Acts, which are just a bunch of narratives about what Christians are up to, as well as early martyr stories, is one of the things that often gets Christians in trouble is you convert somebody's wife. And that's a problem because as soon as somebody's wife becomes a Christian, they stop having sex with their husband because apparently that's just what you do when you're a Christian. And the husband does not take fondly to this. And we see similar things going on in Justin's second apology. there's all sorts of evidence to this. So one of the main problems Christians ran into, and this is kind of alien in our post-Protestant, nuclear family, the thing that's important about Christianity is our belief in a nuclear family or something like that. That is so alien to the Christianity we find in the New Testament and in early Christian literature, where, even Matthew has Jesus talking about people being called to be eunuchs from birth. And he doesn't mean literal. He means people called to give up, to practice ascesis, to give up sex and to give up food and to give up meat. Lots of Christians were vegetarians too. So Marcion doesn't seem to be an outlier here. Marcion seems to fit into the Christian image.
Just to poke in there, Revelation, the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of John gives hints that the 144,000 are virgin Israelites, which is strange.
How to make sense of that is another question. I'm not going to be. I'm not going to unravel the Apocalypse of John today, and what is literal and what is figurative in descriptions there is hard to say.
Well, I just think it's interesting. How does that even line up with Judaism? It's a strange thing because Judaism seems to have more of a family-orientated type of religious movement.
Sometimes, but we also have testimony to the Essenes and the Therapeutae, which are sort of like basically I shouldn't call them proto-monastic. There were monastic type movements in Judaism before Christianity comes around, and certainly contemporary with Christianity. We see all sorts of, people living in the desert. So no, I don't think, it is absolutely true that there are elements of Judaism that are sex positive, but Judaism, like every other movement, is lots of different kinds of people doing very different things. And, if you read Philo and stuff, you find various philosophical approaches to that advocate forms of ascesis and self-denial. So
I look forward to seeing your book on or what you write on Marcion with his gospel redactions and stuff, because if there was a Luke that was that's very complicated and complex, but I do think it's interesting. And the last thing I'd like to ask about Marcion, because we could really go into more and spend more time delving probably on details, is he was rich. How does that work? I mean, you're supposed to I don't know.
Fascinating question. We don't know. We know so little about the situation of Christians, the economic, social situation of Christians at the beginning of the 2nd century. We get hints that, there apparently were people who were close to the emperor who were Christians. At the same time, Celsus seems to say, who is preserved for us only in Origins against Contra Celsum, criticizes Christianity as being a movement of the poor and of widows and of, the social dregs of society. And we see similar things in Lucian's passing of Peregrinus, another pagan. This time his work does survive, and seems to suggest that Christians were, viewed as a movement of a popular movement that was associated with the poor and the outsiders. At the same time, Peregrinus in this narrative pretends to be a Christian in order to get hold of their generosity. And so there are people who have money to be generous with. And Peregrinus doesn't seem to have been forced to renounce everything, at least not right away. I forget exactly how that narrative plays out. So there is some connection to, there is some evidence that mainstream Christianity was a movement of the poor.